Hey, welcome back to the deep dive. We are plunging into something, well, incredibly dark and honestly utterly baffling today. You send us this stack of material articles, research, your own notes, all focused on a really chilling historical mystery.
That's right. We're looking at the Cleveland torso murders. Uh, this is a case that didn't just haunt a city, it actively tormented, one of the most famous lawmen in American history.
And our mission in this deep dive, it's really to sift through your sources, unpack the key facts, the grim context of the era, and critically, what the crimes themselves suggest about the mind capable of them. And importantly, strictly based on what's in the material you provided.
Exactly. It's a story set against the harsh backdrop of Cleveland in the 1930s. You've got this series of incredibly gruesome unsolved murders unfolding, and the killer's signature. It was just horrific.
Yeah, victims dismembered, often decapitated, their torsos frequently being the main remains left behind. Just brutal.
Utterly brutal. And it baffled the police, including, yes, Eliot Ness, fresh off taking down Al Capone.
Right, and this case became his most frustrating unsolved puzzle.
It really did. And that fact alone, that the killer was never caught, that's a huge part of this case's enduring sort of macabre pull, isn't it?
It absolutely is. It's like a phantom killer. So, okay, let's ground ourselves. At its core, what is this story really about?
It's about the Cleveland torso murderer, or, as the sources sometimes call him, with that truly chilling nickname, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run.
The Mad Butcher. Yeah, that name says a lot.
It does. And this reign of terror, it happened in the 1930s right there in Cleveland, Ohio. You nailed the signature earlier. A series of unspeakably brutal murders. Victims systematically dismembered, frequently decapitated.
And often, yeah, just the torso remained or was the first thing found.
Precisely. And, I mean, the shocking standout fact from the start, something you mentioned that just grabs you, the killer was never caught.
Never.
Never. Which, as you said, makes the involvement of Eliot Ness so significant. He was the city's safety director from, 35 to 42?
Yeah, that period. Here's the guy who supposedly cleaned up Chicago, right? And this case becomes his white whale, his most prominent failure, in a way, to catch the bad guy. The pressure on him must have been unimaginable.
Oh, absolutely immense. And to really understand this story, you have to understand Cleveland in the 1930s. I mean, this wasn't exactly a prosperous time.
No, not at all. This was the brutal height of the Great Depression.
And that socioeconomic context isn't just like background noise.
Yeah.
It's fundamental to the whole thing. The Depression created these vast marginalized populations, drifters, homeless people, folks struggling in extreme poverty.
Sometimes involved in sex work, living in makeshift shantytowns.
Exactly. Shantytowns that sprung up anywhere they could, especially in places like Kingsbury Run.
And tragically, your sources make it really clear these became the victims. The material points to about, 12 official victims attributed to this killer, but maybe more.
Potentially more, yeah. And yes, many were pulled from these very fringes of society. It's a really sad detail that only a few were ever identified. So many remain John Does and Jane Does.
Their vulnerability. That's a critical piece of this puzzle, isn't it?
It really is. Their transient lives, the lack of strong family or social ties, their desperate circumstances, it made them easy prey.
Right. They weren't immediately reported missing, maybe not reported at all sometimes.
Which gave the killer more time, didn't it? More time to operate before the bodies were even discovered.
And Kingsbury Run itself, your sources describe it so vividly. It wasn't some, scenic park.
No, far from it. It was a grim, impoverished area, alongside a railroad ravine and a creek bed filled with these desperate shanty towns.
Yeah.
Just decay and despair, really.
And it wasn't just where the victims lived, it was often where the bodies were dumped.
Yeah, that suggests the killer knew this desolate, forgotten area intimately. He used its isolation. And the fact that, few people who lived there were really in a position to come forward or be seen as credible witnesses, he used that to his advantage. It was his dumping ground.
Okay, so let's talk about the grim signature of these crimes, the method itself. As we've touched on, decapitation and dismemberment were this killer's horrifying calling card.
The sources really hammer this home. Victims were almost always beheaded, sometimes chillingly, the analysis suggests, while still alive or maybe immediately post-mortem, and their limbs were removed.
And what's really striking, as the material points out, is the variation in the skill level.
Yes. Some cuts showed clear anatomical knowledge, almost surgical precision, but others were far cruder, more like hacking. It's confusing.
And the discovery pattern was often the same. Torsos found first. Right?
Often, yeah. Sometimes other parts found later, sometimes never at all.
Determining the exact cause of death must have been incredibly difficult.
Hugely difficult because of the state of the remains. But decapitation was often listed as the probable cause. Beyond the dismemberment, the sources also note other post-mortem mutilations, specifically the castration of some male victims.
And your material is careful to point out this wasn't typically overt sexual assault in the, let's say, traditional sense.
Correct. But the dismemberment, particularly that castration, it carries these profound symbolic sexual overtones. The sources suggest that for this killer, the act of mutilation itself was the sexual act.
The source of gratification.
Exactly. It was about power, control, violating, destroying the human form. It's a really disturbing concept.
Wow. And the sources also mention other chilling details, like some bodies appearing drained of blood, and speculation about chemical treatment of the remains.
Yeah, possibly to preserve them or change their appearance, maybe hinder identification. That adds layers of disturbing detail to an already horrifying picture. Every time you think you've grasped the horror, there's something else.
So, with these unspeakable crimes happening, the pressure on the authorities, specifically Eliot Ness, must have been just immense. He was public safety director from 35 to 42.
And he was facing not just the murders, but escalating public panic, media sensationalism, the whole 9 yards. But his investigation faced these colossal challenges right from the start.
Yeah, number one being the unidentified victims, right? How do you even start to trace someone's history or connections when you don't know who they are?
Exactly. And think about the tech back then. We're decades away from DNA. Fingerprinting existed, sure, but the killer seemed careful, maybe wore gloves, who knows?
Plus that transient witness pool in areas like Kingsbury Run.
Another massive hurdle. People were distrustful of police, or they just disappeared themselves. They moved on.
And the killer was clearly meticulous in some ways, leaving few traditional forensic clues at the disposal sites. It's like they vanished after leaving the bodies.
Which really posed the question for Ness. How do you even begin to find someone this careful, this elusive? Which led to, well, his highly controversial tactic in August 1938.
Ah, right, the infamous Kingsbury Run raid. Ness ordered hundreds of vagrants rounded up and arrested, and then had the shantytowns burned to the ground.
Yeah. The stated goal, according to your sources, was basically to deny the killer his hunting ground and potential victim pool, a drastic measure.
But the criticism was immediate and pretty significant, wasn't it?
Oh, yeah. Seen as heavy-handed, it destroyed potential evidence that might have been in those encampments, and it cruelly displaced desperate people who literally had nowhere else to go.
And there's still this big debate, right? The murderers seemed to stop in Cleveland after that raid, but was that because of Ness's action or just a coincidence? Did the killer leave? Die?
The sources highlight that debate. It's definitely one of the many big unanswered questions in this case. Did it work, or did something else happen?
And because the killer was never caught, we're left, as your material points out, to speculate purely on the mind capable of these acts. This is where the psychology angle, derived only from the analysis presented in the sources, becomes so crucial. What does the sheer horror tell us about the person?
Well, what's absolutely chilling in the analysis is the focus on extreme sadism and what they term depersonalization. Dismemberment isn't just destruction. It's described as this profound act of dehumanizing the victim, reducing them to mere objects, pieces.
Obliterating their identity.
Exactly. It speaks to this deep rage, maybe a desperate need to obliterate identity. One source uses this really striking phrase, describing the killer as playing a grotesque god with human anatomy, seeing victims as just raw material.
Wow, grotesque god. That really paints a picture. And that ties back to the variation in skill we discussed, right? The anatomical knowledge versus the cruder cuts.
It does. The sources present this as a point of analysis. Does the skill suggest a specific background, like a doctor, surgeon, maybe even a butcher, implying a cold, methodical mindset? Or do the rougher cuts indicate pure rage, less skill, maybe even different moods?
Or, less likely according to the sources, multiple killers.
Less favored, yeah, but it's mentioned. The focus generally remains on a single individual, but that variation is puzzling.
And let's revisit that sexual sadism point, because the sources really emphasize its symbolic nature here.
Yes, they're very clear. The dismemberment, the decapitation, the castration, these are seen as strong indicators of profound sexual sadism. It wasn't about typical intercourse. The mutilation itself was the source of the sexual gratification.
It's all about power and control.
Power, control, the violation, the destruction of the human form.
Yeah.
Your sources use phrases like the blade is a fetish, the dismembered body as a tableau, finding gratification in the power over the human form's integrity. It's a deeply, deeply disturbed sexual impulse focused purely on destruction.
And yet, despite this apparent frenzy, this killer was clearly not some disorganized maniac running wild. He operated for years.
Selected victims carefully, transported bodies and parts, and evaded Ness and his entire team. That points to being organized and cunning.
Highly intelligent and capable of complex planning, it seems. The sources also speculate he needed a secure, private place to commit these acts, what they term an abattoir, basically a hidden slaughterhouse.
Yeah, and the fact that this space was never found just points again to his cunning in selecting and maintaining it. That hidden space becomes central to understanding his psychology. It's a place of absolute control where he could carry out these horrific acts completely undetected.
And leaving the body parts where they would definitely be found, could that have been a deliberate choice? Like taunting behavior?
The sources definitely raise that as a possibility, a potential taunt to the police, to society,
Yeah.
a way to display his power and contempt. Each discovery, almost like one source calls it a macabre art installation.
Chilling. And the crimes happening right under Eliot Ness's nose. That must have added a psychological layer, possibly a game for a narcissistic killer. I know the sources mention alleged taunting postcards, particularly if you consider the main suspect.
Yes, the sources note the possibility that challenging a high-profile figure like Ness could feed a narcissistic need for control and recognition, even if it's anonymous recognition. The alleged postcards are key to that theory, linking back to the speculation about Dr. Sweeney.
Okay, let's dig into those potential underlying drivers as presented in the source material. What could possibly drive someone to this kind of extreme?
The analysis in your sources suggests things like a deep-seated need for omnipotent control, destructive urges taken to the absolute extreme, maybe a profound alienation from humanity, even hatred, seeing other people as just expendable raw material, not individuals.
And the acting out of dark fantasies.
Right, with dismemberment being a very specific and extreme paraphilia, that term for an atypical sexual interest. The act itself is the fantasy.
A response to perceived powerlessness is mentioned too, but that sounds more speculative in the sources.
It's mentioned as a possibility, yeah, but it seems less emphasized than the themes of control and destructive impulses. And while they acknowledge the possibility of underlying mental illness, psychosis, psychopathic personality disorder, they always balance that by noting his clear ability to plan, operate for years, and evade capture.
So not someone completely detached from reality?
No, he could function effectively enough to avoid getting caught for a long time, which is terrifying in itself.
There's also the sheer silence of the butcher. Unlike, some killers who leave manifestos or taunt publicly, his message seems written purely in blood and bone. What does that silence tell us, according to the analysis?
It's a really chilling silence. It could suggest a different kind of psychological need, maybe not for verbal communication or explanation, but for the act itself to be the message, the final statement. Pure action over words.
And his impact on the city's psyche. He basically infected Cleveland with collective fear. How did he react to that? Did he feed on becoming this living nightmare?
That's a question the sources raise implicitly. Does a killer like this feed on the fear they create? Does becoming a boogeyman satisfy some need? We can only guess based on the patterns.
Now, the sources do briefly mention suspects, and there's one who really looms large in the material provided.
Yes, Dr. Francis E. Sweeney. He's a key figure in the discussion of suspects. He was a doctor, had a history of alcoholism. Your material notes that some investigators, including Ness himself privately, found him highly suspicious.
And he certainly had access to medical tools and anatomical knowledge, which fits with some of the precision we talked about.
Right. And he committed himself to an institution not long after the last canonical murders occurred. Crucially, according to the sources, he allegedly sent taunting postcards to Ness from the institution.
He was a favorite of Ness's, as the material puts it, but Ness just couldn't build a prosecutable case. Lack of definitive evidence, maybe Sweeney's connections, his institutionalization, it all got in the way.
There was another suspect mentioned too, based more on witness accounts, just referred to as the man of large proportions.
Big.
Very vague. But the absolute key takeaway, which your sources constantly reinforce, is that the killer was never definitively identified. It remains unsolved. Officially, anyway.
Which brings us right back to that central question that just hangs over the whole case. Why did he stop?
And the sources present the main theories we've touched on. Did Ness's raid on Kingsbury Run actually work? By removing his victim pool or disrupting his hunting ground? Did the killer simply die? Was he incarcerated for some other crime? Did he just move away from Cleveland?
Or if Sweeney was the killer, did his commitment to the institution effectively end the reign of terror?
Exactly. It's just this void of definitive answers, leaving all those possibilities hanging there.
And this enduring anonymity, the fact that this monster, whoever he was, successfully remained a phantom, it really leads to that final provocative thought for you, the listener, to ponder based on the themes in the material.
Given the gruesome precision we've discussed and the sheer ability to evade capture for so long, what does the Cleveland Torso murderer's anonymity really reveal about the nature of elusive evil and about the terror of a monster who successfully remains just a phantom?
Well, this deep dive into the sources you provided on the Cleveland Torso murders has certainly taken us into a very dark and unsettling chapter of history.
It really has. It's a case that vividly illustrates that devastating intersection of, societal despair during the Depression and this profound, almost inexplicable individual depravity.
And as we've explored from the material you gave us, it endures as a complete mystery, leaving us with these chilling questions and ultimately no solid answers.
Thank you for bringing this fascinating, albeit deeply unsettling topic and all the source material for this deep dive. It was a lot to process.
We appreciate you sharing it with us, and we look forward to seeing what you bring us for the next deep dive.